During his time at Georgetown, Cole was inspired to begin penning his first book, Grey Boy, Finding Blackness in a White World, and today resides in Sydney, Australia, where he's joining us from today. And so Grey Boy was reviewed by the New York Times, and they said, there are gripping anecdotes and keen observations, sometimes from his perspective and sometimes from those of others. And as well as mentioned from Publishers Weekly, which said that it was a heartfelt and insightful debut memoir, his lyrical prose making this coming of age story a pleasure to read. And so some other things that are keeping him busy nowadays, Cole, I might be taking everything you're going to say, but some other things keeping him busy nowadays are an interview with Good Day New York Live with Laurie Stokes, an appearance on ABC's The Drum to discuss American politics, and serving as a guest panelist on Australia's highest rated TV show, Watching Q&A Us. And so with that, we are going to get started with our Q&A. We have some questions set up as of right now, but guys who are joining us today, if you have any, please send them in the chat. You can send them privately to me, and I can just help filter through them so that we can make sure to get your questions answered. All right, so we can get started then. And so with that, let's see. Okay, so for question number one, this is a great place to start since I mentioned your book. You've written a book that basically focuses on the experiences of living in between Black and white worlds. So why did you choose the title of Grey Boy, and what importance does that have to you?
Sure. So one, I just want to again say thank you for having me. I'm excited about this and inspiring to see so many young people, engaged in this. I'll give a bit of background on the book. I don't know how clear everybody is on that before I answer that question, which I'm happy to. So the book, I started writing this when I was a junior at Georgetown. I'm now 2 years out of college, so it took me about 4 years to complete. Released in September. And it's about, as you just mentioned, the experience of growing up Black in white spaces, and trying to sort of figure out one's identity when you're doing so. So kind of the middle school years, high school years, and struggling with figuring out kind of who you are, both as an individual, but as a Black person in an environment that doesn't really have, isn't good at telling you what that means. So the title Grey Boy comes from a poem that I read from Amiri Baraka called Letter to Half-White College Students. And in that poem, he's really critical of kids like the ones I'm talking about, like me, where he's basically questioning kind of, are they Black enough? Are we Black enough? And also answering that question with the answer no. So I think he says, are you sure you're not so full of Elizabeth Taylor that Richard Burton is coming out of your ears? Are you sure you are not an imitation Grey Boy? And when I read that imitation Grey Boy, it really stuck with me. I liked the fact that with the title of my book, I could take that term and kind of turn it on its head and be proud of being gray, be proud of sort of being caught in between. I thought it was a good way to capture the subject matter of the book.
Amazing. All right, and I noticed you're wearing a gray sweatshirt. Just caught my eye as you were talking about that.
There you go.
Unrelated, but you know. All right. Let's see. Another question. When did you first start questioning your identity and your fit in the Black community, and what helped you the most in ultimately finding your Blackness?
So when did I first start questioning? I think that when I was. I think that kids develop an awareness of race at a pretty early stage in life. So even second, third, fourth grade, maybe there might have been sort of some interactions with my peers that were causing that, but there's a lot of interactions with my parents. My parents, even at that early age, making me read certain books, having certain conversations with me, because they were concerned about the potential for me to go out into the world and not feel good about, not feel confident about sort of who I am as a Black individual in this world. They were concerned that if they didn't teach me what Blackness meant, that the world would, and the world would teach, a much more biased lesson about who I am. So I think that early on I start to ask those questions. But that being said, I think that it really begins to hit with force when you get into those middle school years. At least it did for me. I remember 6th, 7th grade when people are all of a sudden sort of hyper aware of race, just as they're all of a sudden hyper aware of other influences as well. And and in that time when kids are sort of reassessing how we attribute value to each other, and who is worthy and who is not, I think it's just difficult to be the one that is dissimilar to the others. So I started to sort of ask those questions, and had some more difficult times in those years as well.
I can definitely connect with some of what you're saying there.
Yeah.
And relating to talking about your youth, there's a question that I have here. We hear a lot about the mental challenges that the youth experience. So a question is, what has been the impact on your mental health as a Black person in these environments when you were younger, of course, and now as well? And how do you deal with that?
That's such an important question. When I was younger, if anyone has a chance to read the book, you'll find that I I had some real difficulties with mental health, particularly when I was younger, particularly in those years that I was talking about, seventh grade, eighth grade, ninth grade. There's one chapter that deals with, pretty explicitly deals with depression, and my own depression, and sort of how I worked through that. Um, so the short answer to sort of how what was the impact on my mental health, the short answer there is, like, it was a big one. I mean, like, it was really detrimental to my mental health, and my sense of worth, my sense of value and belonging, in that space, but also in this world. And it got pretty dire there for a second. I mean, it got pretty bad, which is all in the book. But in terms of how do I deal with that, I think for me, what the biggest change in my own life, and everybody has to, I guess, come to their own answer on this. But for me, the biggest shift that happened was I moved lunch tables. So there's a chapter in the book called The Black Table. And I think many kids will be familiar with the institution that is the Black Table. My cafeteria had one table in one corner of the room that was the Black Table. Um, and I moved to the Black Table when I was in the 10th grade, maybe late ninth grade. And I still remember that well. I mean, like, I'm now 25, and so this would have been 10 years ago, and it's still, it is just as big a deal in my mind when I moved to sit with the other Black kids. And what they did for me was in that space that was not created for us, we were able to carve out some sense of control. We were able to carve out one little world within that larger world that was just for us. And we had a lot of really hard conversations. But for the first time, I felt like I was surrounded by kids that understood my experience, and they really helped sort of pull me out of some of those more difficult moments.
Yes, that sense of community is definitely something that's really critical. I know you just mentioned that idea of that small space, that small world in which you could have those conversations.
Yeah.
Outside of those spaces, we have a question here about what it means to code switch and why it's necessary for African Americans. So what would happen outside of that small little world that you were able to create?
Yeah. So sort of what it means to code switch. I think that commonly code switching refers to being familiar with and a part of one culture. And in most cases, it's like being familiar with and part of sort of Black culture, and then entering a predominantly white space. Oftentimes, like the school or the corporate world or something, and needing to leave some of those cultural markers behind in the Black space in order to gain acceptance in the white space. Um, I think that what's interesting for me, and I talk about this a bit in the book, maybe not as explicitly, is that for me it was almost the reverse. I mean, I grew up in white spaces, and so when I entered the Black Table, which was a Black space, um, there were things that I needed to pick up in order to gain acceptance. There were things that I needed to leave behind in order to gain acceptance. So it was almost like reverse code switching, because there was a lot of awkward attempts to gain acceptance in this group of kids that are now like brothers to me. But I think that now I mean, that is a culture that is a part of me, and now I'm out in the world. I do have sort of a corporate job, and I'm experiencing code switching the way it's more traditionally spoken about, where in order to sort of move through my workplace, there's certain conversations I just can't have. the question was, why is it necessary? I think that I might disagree with the premise there. Like, it might not be necessary depending on the path that one chooses. In my own life, I think that it is necessary in my workplace. And why? It's because some of those cultural markers will be interpreted by people in power as speaking to my intelligence, as speaking to my value, as speaking to my potential to contribute to the organization. And I don't want them to, even though that would be a misinterpretation, I don't want them to see that and penalize me for it.
That's a good point. I could definitely also agree with that and see where you're coming from with regard to code switching and the idea of like having to kind of switch into it and then have to switch back. I can kind of feel that growing up in Flemington, New Jersey.
Yes. And I should also, actually, before we move on, I should also say that there's an element of that. I mean, we've mentioned briefly now the fact that we're both Ethiopian. There's also an element of that is like the immigrant experience as well, right? Where we don't have sort of a typical immigrant story in my family, but I do have a lot of family still in Ethiopia, and there is an element of like trying to jump into Ethiopian spaces and jumping out of them and receiving acceptance there as well. So I think that there's something that doesn't just go black white. I think it goes sort of cross culturally.
Completely agree that like idea of being Ethiopian, being Black, those are like the same in some cases, and some people consider it different. And that, and exactly. Totally understand, but no one wants to hear me talk. They want to hear you talk. So I'm going to move on to another question. So actually, this also relates to school. It's a question that we received from one of our audience members. So Sufyan, hopefully I said that correctly, when asked the question, in school, did you have a good insight on African and African American history, or did you have to learn a lot on your own?
So I think there's a couple answers to that. One is that, and this is like there was actually a chapter in the book that didn't make the final cut. I cut the whole thing right before it went out. But one of the last chapters in the book was going to talk about the Black teachers that I've had in my schooling career, and I had a couple of them. I was fortunate. I mean, a lot of people don't. A lot of people can go through all of their education without having a Black teacher. I did. And Black teachers, I mean, this is not my opinion. There is research that this is the studied impact of Black teachers is that they dramatically change the trajectory of their Black pupils, particularly Black boys. Black boys' outcomes are dramatically better when they've had a Black teacher, particularly in the early years. So I was fortunate that I did have a few Black teachers that made it their business to educate me about my people, when the school wasn't necessarily doing that. That said, in between the Black teachers that I had, and there was maybe 3 of them, the school wasn't doing much. But when they weren't doing much, I was also fortunate that I had a family that was steeped in that history and knew its importance. So I write about this in the book. Like when I was in 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, I still remember like my dad just handing me a stack of books like this, books that no 3rd, 4th, 5th graders should be reading: Autobiography of Malcolm X, Autobiography of Frederick Douglass, Black Boy by Richard Wright, and telling me to, like, handing me a journal and saying, you have to write a book report on each of these each Saturday. That might be overkill, but I'm not sure I would suggest that for everyone. But that was how early on, when the school wasn't giving it to me, that was how I got my history.
My dad gave me books to read, but he didn't make me write a book report, so not all the way there. Another question I have here with regard to school, it's from Madison Law. So she wrote, how do you suggest raising awareness about diversity in majority white suburban schools? When all white school boards are making decisions, how can we bring about more representation?
Yeah, I mean, one answer to that is that, like, I've been so inspired. I mean, like, I'm not a student anymore. So in some ways, like, I'm not going to say like this isn't my fight, but it's like I am not the best soldier for this fight anymore. Like in so many ways you all are. And you all could answer that question better than I could. I will say that one is super inspiring thing to me has been all that we've seen on Instagram. I don't know if sort of your school or the schools near you had this. I know that many across the country did, and mine certainly did, around black at insert school here. And that has caused real change. Black kids and Black alumni telling their stories that are tragically similar over decades of schooling. The fact that I can tell the same stories of racist interactions that someone that graduated in the 90s can tell, that I think is having real impact at schools. So I think that, we're in a moment right now where it is expected and heard when students really apply pressure, and make their voices heard. And I'm so inspired by the fact that students aren't letting that moment go to waste. And I think that the answer is that we should continue to tell our stories and press on, the people in power, to make the changes that you want to see.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, we are at an event for Advocacy Week, so the whole point is about getting people to use their voices because they really do have an impact and can make an impact. Yeah. All right, let's see. This is another question that I received in the chat, once again in that school theme. What do you think can be done to prevent students from feeling discrimination among each other in school? So what can be done to help students make a difference in the experience of their fellow students who might not feel, who might be feeling other?
Yeah, that's a difficult one, because I think that discrimination often goes hand in hand with, kids can just be mean. I don't know how else to, I don't really know a more eloquent way to say that. There were just, there was the discrimination that I was feeling. I'm sure that girls cross-racially were feeling sexism and its sort of impact at a young age. I just think that every type of bullying is present in that young age at times. My opinion is that I think that the answer, or perhaps one of the answers, it's exactly what we were just talking about, which is education that includes speaking to the value of other experiences. I think that part of the reason sort of one can feel empowered and emboldened to speak disparagingly about other experiences is that they haven't been told that these experiences have value. So what we were just speaking about in terms of an education that clearly places value on our experiences, that clearly tells the school community, we belong here. Not only you are not doing me a favor by having me here. I am doing you a favor by being present, because I bring a new element to this school that contributes value. I think that's how that's done. It's people in power expressing to the entire student body, not just a segment of the student body, this experience is valuable, and we honor and cherish the fact that it is in our community.
Definitely. And this is a little bit of a departure from the school idea, but it kind of ties into the idea of how to support your fellow individuals within a school and how people in power can support them. One question that I have here is how can white people be better allies to Black colleagues? So just generally speaking, how can we all support each other? To be a little bit more broad, how can we all support each other when we have different experiences?
Yeah, I'm going to sound like a broken record for this. I think there's two answers. One, I think that empathy goes a long way. I'm in Sydney, Australia, and there's just not many Black people here, period. And I work at a company where I work at a pretty big company, and I'm literally the only Black employee in the entire Australia, New Zealand network, which is astonishing. So you want to talk about like being a token, being the only one. I am literally the only one out of several hundred, if not a few thousand. And when, for instance, the George Floyd murder happened, I I was really sort of topsy-turvied in myself. I was really struggling with that, as I think a lot of people back home were. Felt very isolated in the work community, and I think that what it would have gone a long way then if some of those people that I work with saw that headline and connected it to real experiences that real people are having, such as their only Black colleague. There was a few that did. There was many that didn't. So I think that one necessary mental link to make is the link between, you know, all that we're seeing out there and the fact that it has real implications for real people that you know. You know, understanding that the Breonna Taylor death is not just a headline for so many. Uh, Understanding that for me, for instance, Trayvon Martin died when I was, you know, was killed when I was in when I was in high school, and that had real implications for my life. And I don't know. I feel as though sort of an important leap for white people to make is that, you know, seeing that connection, and being empathetic to it and commenting on it in a way that is respectful and understanding. But then two, when I say I was going to sound like a broken record, it's because, again, my answer is also educating yourself on our stories. I think that it's easy to be skeptical and flippant about some of the, like, the reading lists that went around Instagram for you know, a week after the murder of George Floyd, and I understand people's skepticism of that, like, social media activism, but I do think that, like, reading is important. I do think that, like, you know, understanding, trying to engage with the Black experience as it has been written for generations, honestly and openly, is an important step to make, because I am so clear on European history, and so many white people I know nothing about us, and I think that it's important to, you know, if you consider yourself an ally, to change that.
Definitely. I mean, like the first step to like humanizing an issue and empathizing with it is trying to understand it, and you can't if you're not
Exactly.
educated about it. So 100% agree on that one.
Absolutely.
You just spoke a little bit about your experience living as a Black male in Australia, just a little bit. So that cut out one of my questions. You just answered it. Thank you.
Yes.
Another one I have here, though, relates to your experience when you were living in the United States and growing up in the
Yep.
United States. So with the, you touched on a little bit, with the Black Lives Matter movement and social justice being top of mind for most of us these days, just what were some of the inequities that you faced as a young Black male in America, and then how and then did your privileged upbringing in any way shield you from those injustices that we commonly associate with the movement?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The I'll take it in reverse order. So the did privilege shield me? I think the answer there is yes and no. Yes, sort of uh, the structural manifestations of racism, you know, generational poverty, decrepit, you know, like really underfunded educational institutions, you know, things like that we see as structural in nature. I was frankly shielded from. You know, I was within in an environment that was privileged, and therefore protected and distant from much of the plight of the Black experience from that perspective. Now, what I will say, and I write about this in the book, is that it's easy to live that life and convince yourself that you have somehow therefore transcended away from you know, that sort of discrimination entirely, and that I can assure you is not the case. I write in the book, one of the final chapters is called "The Reveal," and it talks about exactly that. It talks about how you sort of, because you're in this coddled environment, you live this life thinking that you've escaped that, and then when you find out that you haven't, when you confront bigotry for the first time head on, it is a really disruptive experience, and I call that the reveal. My own example of the reveal in the book is that you know, I was playing soccer and was in Delaware, and at a school that I guess I won't name, and was in this stadium, a ton of people there. Of all the people, my mother and I are the only two Black people, and for really no reason at all. Uh, After I sort of get into a heated thing on the soccer field, one of the players turns around and says, you don't even belong here, get the F out of here, nigger. And then spits on me. And I had had encounters that were clearly, I wasn't ignorant to sort of prejudice at that point. I had had encounters that were clearly biased and racist even, but that level of just pride in minimizing another human being to their lowest qualities, you know, the look that he gave me while literally spitting on me, I mean, I had never seen that before. So there were, so the answer is yes, I did deal with it. Everything from sort of minor microaggressions that I'm sure many of us deal with daily, to much more egregious acts like that, like being in a house party, and I write about this in the book, being in a house party and the cops sort of putting us on the ground, me and the only other Black kid in the house party, and pulling guns out on us. I had a few of those encounters as well. So yes and no.
That definitely like struck a chord with me. I know this is a question not even off the list that just came to mind for me, but I know this is something that comes up for myself and for my family. My brother is a lot darker than I am, just like
Mhm.
generally speaking. It's just like Ethiopians are like way many different shades. But I was just wondering, how has your experience as a light-skinned Black person, like how has that shaped you specifically
Yeah.
in contrast to those who you may know who are darker skinned?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. It's often difficult to comment on how the roles we inhabit, that are positions of power, shape us. So, like, I guess what I mean by that is it's, you know, it's easy for me to comment on how being a Black person shapes me as an oppressed role. It is much more difficult, for instance, for me to comment on how being a man shapes me as a, because that is a position of power. I think that when you inhabit one of those identities, you're often not as conscious about it. Being light skinned is certainly, that would be the case. There are, you know, there are definitely advantages that I have experienced that people in my own family, similar to you, you know, I am the lightest in my family, and people in my own family don't experience it. If I had to sort of quickly think about uh what that looks like, I guess the first example that comes to me, frankly, is dating. I think that um I'm trying to think of a delicate way to say this. That I was somehow more palatable, that I was somehow less threatening to my peers, um, um, because of the fact that I was light skinned. I mean, I had, you know, many of my friends are dark skinned, and I think that I was seen as in some ways just like more worthy, more attractive, um, because of my light skin color. It's wrong. I mean, to say the least. But I certainly think that that was the case.
Thank you. I know that like just came to mind for me, so I wanted to
Yeah.
ask. This is a little bit backtracking in the conversation, but it goes back to the question of like America versus Australia. One of the questions I got in the chat from Akshat is where do you find people to be more accepting as a whole, in America or Australia?
That's a good question. I so the answer for me is here, but like Australia, but and there's a key caveat to that. Like, America has a history of oppressing and brutalizing and subjugating Black people, and we all exist within that history, and therefore, um, when you are operating sort of in a day to day, you almost don't realize how much of the interactions that you're having are founded upon that history. So all of the microaggressions we were just talking about, they happen in part because they are the product of that history. Australia does not have that history. It doesn't have a history of you know, violence and brutalization specifically of Black people, and for that reason, many of those interactions that we're talking about just don't happen to me here. You know, like I actually wrote an article in the one of the big newspapers here shortly after the death of George Floyd, where I talked about how like refreshing it was that I could go around town and hail a cab and walk into a nice store, and they would greet me and ask me if I needed anything. Those little things that just sort of cut away at you in the US, none of that happens to me here. The key caveat is that Australia has its own history. You know, like just because it doesn't have a history of oppressing and brutalizing Black people doesn't mean it doesn't have a history of oppression and brutalization. It just so happens that it's a different group. And the group for Australians is Aboriginal and Indigenous people. And Aboriginal and Indigenous people are subject to the same, if not a greater degree of indignity and injustice here as we are back home. So for me specifically, I've been pleased with the experience that I found here. It is surprising, you have to kind of convince yourself to get off edge when you walk into a room full of white people, because all the rooms are full of white people, but it'll be okay. But I will say that this is not, that doesn't mean that this is sort of a fanciful, perfect place. It really is not.
And kind of as a follow-up to that question, now that like not living in the United States, like looking at it from the outside, how has that maybe shifted your perspective in how how like America is perceived, but then also how you perceive it from looking at it from another country?
Yeah, that's actually precisely what I think the title of the article I wrote was something like looking at America from afar, and that's precisely what I was talking about in that article is how when you move yourself out of a context, whether that's America or you change schools, I mean, whatever it is, you have a different perspective on it, right? You're able perhaps to look at it sort of from arm's length and perhaps more objectively. I guess what I will say, perhaps this isn't a great insight, but the one thing that has really struck me since I've been here is just how consequential American misbehavior these last few months has been for our reputation on a global stage. It's like embarrassing to be an American here, to be totally honest. Just like with how poorly we have handled so many of the issues that we've been confronting over the last several months. And when I say we, I mean both sort of the populace in some cases, but really the government. It has been handled so poorly that I don't know that our reputation as a nation can be repaired in the short and medium term, at least. We've done real damage to it. And you also develop an appreciation for just how strong that reputation was until recently. I mean, I'm in a country that looks to America for so much. I mean, looks to America for protection, but also looks to America for many of its cultural cues. Really values what America has done globally. And even here, they're like, what the hell are y'all doing? and I agree with that. I really think that it's a shame.
All right, this is going back a little bit again, but this time to the school element of things. I received a question from Annabelle. It says, when you were a student, did you notice teachers treating you differently than other students? And if this happened, how did that affect you?
Yes, Annabelle, I did. It happened to all of us. And when I say us, I mean the Black table, but it definitely happened to me. I switched schools. I haven't gotten to talk about this, which is why it's flowing out right now. I switched schools between 7th and 8th grade. I went to from a school called Chestnut Hill Academy to a school called Penn Charter. Part of the reason I switched is because by the end of 7th grade, I had racked up like too many suspensions to today count. Like I can't I don't know, 6th and 7th grade, I might have been suspended like 5 times. I mean, something absurd. And it was all for like just minor ticky-tacky stuff. And I saw it happening to so many of the Black kids that were at school. I mean, when I was in the 7th grade, I think that we were a class of 40, 50 people, probably 50 people. And we had a huge Black population for that school. So I think we had like 15 kids or something. It was the highest non-white group that had ever been in a single class. Of those 15, all 15 had switched schools or tried to by the 9th grade. And the reason that there was just this mass exodus is because we were in a schooling system that was just clearly overly punitive to Black kids. I mean, like we just couldn't mess up in the same ways that others could. And and I struggled with that. I mean, like you asked me how I dealt with it. I mean, how I dealt with it might not be how everyone should deal with it. I switched schools, and got to a place that I think still had some of those issues, but not quite as egregiously. But I definitely think that is real. And again, that's like another studied thing. That's not just like anecdotal, the experience that you're having and the experience that I'm having. It's well recorded that schools are just much more punitive to Black kids, just much less accepting of things that all kids do, when it's perpetrated by a Black body. So that's real. I feel that.
Thank you. We actually have a question. We're going to have one of our audience members unmute and ask.
Good.
Sufyan, go ahead.
How you doing? I'm the
What's
one with the
up?
mask on. Yeah, I got a question.
Yeah. Oh, you froze for me. Can you hear me?
Ooh, I think he froze for me too. Let me see. Sufyan?
Was he able to type the question in maybe?
Oh, maybe. If you can hear us, you can type in your question, or if your connection comes back, just let me know and I'll let you ask it, okay? I actually have another question in the chat, so we can get that answered while we're waiting for his connection to come back.
Cool.
Laura asked, how did you deal with the feeling of cultural disconnect from your peers growing up? And what advice would you give to kids with immigrant parents who deal with that experience?
Oh, that's real. So let me give a caveat. I mentioned this briefly earlier. I don't have sort of a traditional immigrant experience in the sense that my family biologically is Ethiopian. My mother was actually put up for adoption and raised in America and then connected with her Ethiopian family. So that is all to say that sort of my family unit is about as American gets. That said, all of my uncles live in Ethiopia, all of my grandparents live in Ethiopia. They would come often. So I'm kind of like 1.5 generations in. So perhaps not quite the same. How did I deal with the feeling of cultural disconnect? I think that what I struggle with, and perhaps a lot of people struggle with, is feeling as though you have like all of these different identities that are like pulling on you. So being Ethiopian is pulling me in one direction, being Black is pulling me in another, being privileged, being born in the Midwest, being from Philly, whatever it is. All of those many different identities and half identities and what they all mean, and trying to contain them in one body. And my response to that, and I think that the journey that this book tries to chart, is going from a place of really really struggling with that, really struggling with what that means, and not seeing a place for myself in this world, and then landing where I am now, which is to say that if all of those half identities are in one body, then they must not be in conflict. That like if I exist, if I inhabit this world and all of these influences are within me, then they must not conflict with each other. That's a hard journey for one to go on. But I think that it's important to know that. It's important to hear and tell yourself, you know what, like I can be as Ethiopian as I want to be, or whatever culture you're coming from. Or not. And either way, like that is an authentic expression of who I am. I can be as Black as I want to be, whatever that means, or not. And that is an authentic expression of who I am. So I think that that's a much easier conclusion to come to as you get older, frankly, because I think that there's less pressure. I think that in like a high school environment, there's just so much pressure to be one thing, to be one clearly defined identity. But I think that it's important to keep in mind that like that's totally made up. Like there's no reason for that. That like one should be proud of where they come from, and express that in whatever way they wanted to. Uh, uh, and that doesn't need to be, those don't need to be sort of competing qualities, because they're not. They're all who you are, and they all should be embraced.
Amazing answer. That definitely struck a chord with me, Laura. Hope that was what you were looking for. All right, Sufyan said that he's back now, so you can take it away
Cool.
with your
Let's
question.
try it.
Sorry, my Wi-Fi cut up. But I was saying, like, when you was talking about microaggressions and like the cops messing with you, pulling guns on you, most people like will become ignorant, like towards cops saying F the police, ignorance towards white people having hatred in their heart. Like, how did you like overcome that, but and still be like loving towards people and stuff?
Yeah. So I think that, I mean, one, it's important to say like ignorance towards cops when you're actually in that situation is about the worst thing that you can do. And I'm sure, I'm sure you have not gotten to this age without having a conversation with somebody who's told you, how important it is to, when in that situation, sort of be respectful. I mean, that was among the most terrifying moments of my life. It was not the time where I was going to sort of be indignant and be F the police. That was a time when I was like, just trying to survive. But I will say, I mean, to the bigger question that you're asking, I think that it's hard not to be angry a lot of the times. There's a James Baldwin quote: to be a Black person in this country and relatively conscious is to be in a constant state of rage. Which I understand. I think that like injustice is so pervasive, those interactions that we're talking about happen so frequently that it is easy to just get to a place of anger. My counter to that is not criticism. I understand it. My grandfather was like that. I write about my pop in the book, and my pop was just angry. He was just on edge. And if you think about the life of injustice that he led, I understand that. That said, I would argue my counter to that would be that no one is greater harmed by that mentality than you are. I've been in those situations. I was just telling a story maybe 2 days ago when I was in a situation where sort of like I had clearly been treated differently because I was Black, and I got really angry. And I was getting angry, and everybody was looking at me like I was the angry Black guy, which was making me more angry. And like I was just caught in this vicious cycle. And I realized afterwards that like no one in that entire environment was harmed by that other than me. like no one went home as furious with tears other than me that day. So I think that just as like a practical matter, just as like a maintaining your own sanity matter, I think it's important to try to find a place of peace, because you got to live in this world, and if you allow it to sort of tighten you up, to twist you, you will end up being the one that's receives the greatest harm from that.
Yeah, definitely. I know there's a quote somewhere that's like, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting it to kill someone else. So it's kind
right. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. I know we want to be cognizant of your time. We know you have somewhere to be at 7. Is it all right if we ask 2 more questions?
Please.
All right.
I got some time.
All right, amazing. Okay, so we have another one from Annabelle. She said, how do white/Black beauty standards affect you? And was there a certain age where you became aware of them, or was there an event that made you self-conscious?
Yes. So I guess there's 2 stories there. The first one is that what's interesting is that sort of Black beauty. I was told and felt very ugly for a long time. I'm thinking about like those middle school years when beauty standards were such that that was like Justin Bieber had just gotten hot, and he still had the flippy hair, and everybody had the flippy hair, and my hair, as you see, doesn't flip very much. And beauty standards then were so clearly like there was such like this big sort of blonde swooping blue eyes look that everyone had to have, and I didn't have it, and felt very ugly as a result. What was interesting, and I think that this happens more so for guys, frankly, than girls, is that when you get to high school, I was an athlete. I played soccer, and that gives one an identity. And I think sort of almost overnight it went from you know, sort of yuck Cole to almost overnight, you know, Cole's an athlete, and somehow, like, you know, Black men are so often sort of like hyper and overly sexualized, and somehow I fit within that narrative all of a sudden, where, you know, I was like I said earlier, just like the palatable Black guy, and that was equally disgusting to me. What I will say is that in the book I actually write about, I write a bit about sort of the struggle that I saw. I was basically the Black guy in a white friend group for a long time in middle school, and we had that was all guys, and we had a sort of counter to us was the all girl white friend group with one Black girl in it. And I saw how, her name is Cameron, and I saw how Cameron and I sort of navigated the world very differently, because that when that shift happened for me, I remember seeing my sister go through this, how people just like poked fun at Cameron. I mean, just like, you know, I think the world just assumed that Cameron and I would like Cameron and I didn't really know each other, but the world just assumed that we would end up together. And Cameron and I weren't feeling that for no reason other than like we didn't really know each other. But I think that I read about this in the book, that I saw how people sort of poked fun at the idea that Cameron and I would end up together, and didn't value her enough. And I didn't understand that broader game that was being played until I got much older, and until I saw my sister start to go through it, where I think that they didn't fit a even more strictly defined beauty standard for girls, which was similar, which was like sort of like a, you know, this skinny blonde, blue eyes, and I saw how the world sort of made it much more difficult for them than it did for me. I can't at this point remember the question, but if the question was, do I see how that played out? Yes, I see very clearly how that played out. What I will say is, again, if I can leave you with one message, it is that these things are temporary. High school is temporary, middle school is temporary. Like you know, there is a world beyond it. And I was really pleased to find the world that I was dropped into once I left those spaces.
All right, I know I said just one more after this, but I actually got a great question in the chat, so I'll try to make it brief.
Oh, good.
Paraphrasing, this is another one from Sufyan. Just paraphrasing it a bit. What would you say about the injustices or disconnect or animosity that exists between some Black people and African people? So people whose families have immigrated here versus those who have been here for generations.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think that that's a really interesting dynamic, and like a really saddening one to me. You know, I think that you know, in an ideal world, we would see the clear commonalities that bridge us together, and we would see ourselves as a spectrum of one people rather than you know, many subsects of humanity. It really, I struggle with that. You know, there's a book that I just finished up that a lot of people are reading right now called Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. And in Caste, she talks about this. She talks about how, you know, Black people in America, Black Americans are kind of the lowest caste, and Africans will often come and attempt to distance themselves from that caste because they see how that caste is treated. So I'm not sure it's sort of that I have an answer to that, other than that, like, that's real. And I think really unfortunate. I think an expression of an internalization of that hierarchy. You know, like it is clearly us as Black people, sort of in its broadest definition, internalizing power structures that were created to oppress us. And I hope we can find a way to get out of that, because I think that there's so much sort of beauty that both cultures, there's not really only two cultures, but that both of those experiences have to share. There's so much beauty that Black America has contributed to the world, and there's so much beauty in Africa that I hope that we can find a way to bridge that. And I think we're seeing efforts to do that. I've been pretty encouraged lately, how African culture has been sort of folded into the American dialogue in recent years.
Yeah, absolutely. There's like that, like you were saying, and then the other side of things where I know there's like Ethiopians in my family who are like, we're not Black, we're Ethiopian, but I'm like, the cops
Yes.
don't know that when they pull you over. It's okay.
Yes, exactly, exactly.
But yeah, and with our last question, with 6 minutes to spare,
Yeah.
obviously this is an Advocacy Week event, and so that kind of ties into this final question here. Based on what you've seen and experienced, and this is both in the US and Australia, what are some ways that you think young people can influence the government and just generally the world today?
Man, that's a big question. How old are you? Do you mind if I ask?
Oh, I'm 17.
Okay, so you guys. So the reason I'm asking is because you guys can't vote yet. That was going to be my first answer. But in the absence of the ability to vote, I think that this is actually going back to the statement I was making earlier around sort of Black at prep school, accounts on Instagram. I think that what young people are so much more adept at this point is sharing, using the tools that sort of modern day technology has given us to share really honest perspectives. I think that if you have a story to tell, one, that story is legitimate just by virtue of you wanting to tell it. Like, I think that, when I was trying to publish this book, so many people told me that my story was illegitimate, that nobody would be interested. And I think that, one, I should say that, if you have a story to tell, then it is worth other people listening to, period, full stop. You should tell it. But two, any stories that you have to tell, you don't need anyone's permission to tell them. Like any message that you want to get out into the world, you no longer need permission. You don't have to go through a publishing structure that I just had to deal with. That was nonsense. Like, if you have something to say, you have everything at your fingertips to say it. So if there is a message you want out there, the only thing holding you back from sharing it is yourself. Because frankly, like, y'all know better than I do about the ways in which those stories can be told effectively and efficiently through whatever it be, TikTok or Twitter or Instagram or whatever else. Everything you need is before you. So just go out and do it. Don't think, just do it. just tell your tale, because it's worthy of being told.
Amazing. Great note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Absolutely.
It was amazing to hear from you. I know personally for me, I have yet to read your book, but I've been wanting to. I read the title and I was like, this man just articulated something I've been trying to put into words for quite some time. But that was amazing. To anybody else who is like, I need to read this book right now, don't worry. The New Jersey State YMCA Alliance is donating copies of the book for everyone in attendance tonight. So you guys can all get to read it. I'm super excited about that.
Fantastic.
I will make time in my schedule to finish that book. But thank you so much for speaking to us. Oh, did someone say something? Mm-hmm. All right, well, thank you so much for speaking to us. That was absolutely amazing. To everybody in attendance, thank you for joining us tonight. And yeah, this is a great end to the end of Advocacy Week. Sufyan said that he can't wait to read it too. Look at that. We have so many excited readers. But yeah, we can close it out for the night, just shy of 7 o'clock. But thank you for joining us, Mr. Brown, and also thank you to everyone else in attendance.
Right. Thank you so much, and everybody, if you end up reading the book, please feel free to share your thoughts. This group is fantastic, and thank you so much for having me. This was a fantastic conversation. You did a great job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
See you all.
See you all.
Everybody.
Great job, Salam. You can hop to your next thing. I know you gotta go.
Yeah, I gotta go. All right.
Good job, everyone. We will follow up with how to get your copy of your book.
Thank you.